In the northern hills of Mariaca, where cocoa trees tilt toward the valley, and river stones keep their secrets, sits a small village called Harmony Hall. It's the kind of place where days move slow, where the same stories circle back each season, and where peace feels almost fragile, like it could crack if spoken too loud. On a Sunday morning in December 2009, that peace cracked. Church bells rang from St. Agnes Chapel, dogs barked at nothing in particular, and smoke from breakfast fires rose thin into the blue. Then, one sharp sound cut through it all, so quick it took a moment before anyone realized what it meant. It wasn't thunder, it wasn't rain, it was the sound of something ending. Leanna Ruth was 34, known for her patience and her quiet way of speaking. She met Calvin Ruth 14 years earlier at the Nine Mornings Festival in Kingstown. Two strangers pulled together by a spark that for a while looked like forever. They married the following year in a small service at the Anglican Church. For more than a decade, they lived in the faded green house at the Bend, a place that smelled of nutmeg and sewing chalk, where the curtains were always open to the morning sun. They never had children. Some said Leanna couldn't. Others said they'd simply given up trying. Either way, the quiet between them grew over time, settling into the rooms like dust. Calvin had once been proud of his hands, steady, skilled, capable of fixing any engine in the district. But by 2009, work came in bursts, like the rain. Sometimes too much, sometimes none at all. When the jobs dried up, so did his temper. By the end of most weeks, what little he earned often disappeared. A few rounds of white rum at Oscar's bar, a hand of all fours with the same three men, and a walk home through the dark, muttering about bad luck and people who don't respect a man trying. Leanna's patience thinned in silence. Neighbors said the arguments were always about the same thing: the bills, the drinking, and the way Calvin could vanish for hours, returning with pockets empty and eyes glazed. That Sunday morning was no different. The radio played a hymn, the kettle whistled, and behind the closed shutters of the Ruth house, another familiar storm began to rise. When Calvin Ruth stepped through the door that morning, the light inside the house felt too bright. He had not slept properly in days. The bottle from the night before still echoed in his head, a dull, burning hum that turned every thought into a kind of noise. Leanna was at the ironing board, smoothing the folds of a blue cotton dress. She didn't speak at first, and he took that silence as judgment. Lately, every silence between them felt that way, like proof that she had already decided what he was. The room smelled of starch and burnt fabric. The radio muttered a preacher's voice about forgiveness. Calvin dropped his keys on the table, muttered something about the heat, and reached for a glass of water. He wanted the morning to pass without words, but Leanna's patience had worn thin. She asked where he had been, whether he'd collected payment from the engine job down at the wharf. He said the man hadn't shown up, that it wasn't worth arguing over a few dollars. Her voice stayed calm, but there was no softness in it anymore. She mentioned the bills, the empty cupboard, the workshop that had called asking for him, the one that had turned him away the last time he arrived, smelling of rum. Each sentence felt like a nail driven into something he no longer recognized as pride. He told himself she didn't understand that he worked when there was work, that men like him had no say in when the sea or the machines chose to break. But what he really felt was smaller than that, the dull shame of having nothing left to offer. The kettle began to whistle. The sound scraped against his nerves. Leanna set down the iron and turned to him. Her voice shook, but her words were steady. "Calvin, you need help. You can't drink every time the work slows down." Something inside him clenched. He heard not concern but accusation, a verdict handed down by the one person who used to believe in him. His mind filled with fragments, the men at Oscar's laughing when he left early, the landlord's letter under the door, the workshop owner saying, "You used to be better than this." He stared at her, waiting for her to take it back. She didn't. Instead, she said the one thing he couldn't bear. "If you won't change, I can't stay here with you anymore." That was the crack. The words echoed, cold and absolute. To him, they sounded like betrayal, as if everything he had struggled to hold together had already been decided without him. He felt a heat rise in his chest, heavy and pulsing. The room seemed to narrow, as if the air itself was closing in. He walked toward the bedroom, telling himself he only needed to scare her, to make her listen for once. The drawer slid open. Metal clinked softly against wood. Leanna stepped closer, her face pale. "Please, Calvin," she said quietly. "Don't start again. Not today." The kettle screamed louder. He raised the gun without thinking. For a heartbeat, he saw her, the woman he'd met 14 years earlier, standing under Christmas lights, smiling as though nothing in the world could harm them. Then the image vanished beneath the noise in his head. A single shot broke the morning. The whistle of the kettle carried on until the water burned away. Leanna Ruth was gone. Calvin stood over her for a long moment, his breathing even, his thoughts strangely clear. The anger was gone, replaced by a hollow stillness that felt almost peaceful. He stepped outside, closed the door behind him, and walked down the narrow path toward Judith Perryman's shop, the gun still warm in his hand. After the first gunshot, Harmony Hall seemed to stop breathing. The sound echoed off the hillside, rolled through the valley, and faded into an eerie stillness. Inside the greenhouse, steam hissed from the forgotten kettle. Outside, Calvin Ruth stepped into the yard. His movements were slow, deliberate. There was no urgency, no panic, only an unnerving calm. The world around him had narrowed to shapes and colors, the pale blue of the morning sky, the rust red of the soil beneath his boots, and the dull metallic weight of the gun in his hand. He wasn't thinking of what he'd done. He was thinking of how quiet everything had become. He walked down the narrow path that led toward the main road. The voices of the village were still faintly alive. The clang of a bucket, the cry of a vendor, a radio playing somewhere far away. At the bend, near the breadfruit tree, stood Malcolm Peters, a 32-year-old mechanic who lived 3 houses down. He was waiting by the roadside for the morning bus that would take him into Kingstown. He had seen Calvin approaching and lifted a hand in greeting, unaware of what had just happened up the hill. Witnesses later said Calvin raised the gun without hesitation. The first shot caught Malcolm in the stomach, spinning him backward against the bus stop post. He fell instantly, clutching his side, shouting for help. The shot sent birds scattering from the nearby power lines. Windows slammed, dogs barked. Then, silence returned, heavier this time, as though the valley itself was listening. Calvin looked at the man on the ground, but didn't stop. There was no emotion in his face, no sign of triumph or regret. He simply turned and continued walking downhill. The path took him past the small grocery run by Judith Perryman, a woman in her 50s who had known both him and Leanna for years. She had seen their marriage at its best and worst, often telling friends that Calvin just needed something to steady him again. When she heard the shot by the bus stop, Judith came outside, broom in hand, scanning the road. Then she saw him, Calvin, walking toward her, the pistol hanging by his side, his shirt untucked and eyes fixed straight ahead. At first, she called out his name, thinking he might need help, thinking perhaps someone else had been hurt. But he didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. He stopped at the edge of her yard, lifted the gun, and fired twice. The bullets struck her in the chest. She collapsed onto the step, the broom falling beside her. The sound carried through the entire valley to sharp cracks, one after the other. Final punctuation in a morning that had already gone wrong. From then on, Harmony Hall descended into chaos. People ran, shouting, children crying, doors slamming. Some hid in closets, others lay flat on the floor. No one knew how many shots there had been, or who was next. Calvin walked on, shouting fragments of thoughts that made no sense. Words about betrayal, about respect, about everyone laughing behind his back. He reached the edge of the banana field where the path ended, and there, at last, his pace began to slow. He felt the heat of the morning pressing against him, the gun heavy in his hand. The anger that had carried him was fading, leaving behind only a kind of emptiness, a hollow stillness that felt almost peaceful. He sat on a stone near the old river bridge, listening to the water move below. For the first time, he noticed the birds again. He placed the gun beside him, staring at it as though it belonged to someone else. When the police arrived, nearly 3 hours later, they found him there, barefoot, silent, the weapon lying on the rock beside him. He looked up once and said, quietly, "It's done already." And in that strange, quiet moment, Harmony Hall seemed to exhale, the valley slowly filling again with the ordinary sounds of life returning after horror. When the trial of the state versus Calvin Ruth opened in the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court in March 2012, the public gallery was full. Students, journalists, neighbors, even relatives of the victims filled the benches, faces drawn tight with expectation and disbelief. At the center of it all sat Calvin Ruth, head bowed, wrists cuffed in front of him, the same blank expression he'd worn the morning police found him by the river. 3 years had passed since the killings, but in that courtroom, time seemed to collapse. Every testimony, every photograph, every exhibit dragged the island back to that December morning when Harmony Hall stopped breathing. The prosecution began methodically, recounting each name, each wound, each act. The judge listened without expression, his pen moving steadily across the page. Leanna Ruth, shot once in her kitchen. Malcolm Peters, wounded in the abdomen while waiting for the morning bus. Judith Perryman, shot twice outside her shop. The court heard from police officers, forensic technicians, and from Malcolm himself, who survived the shooting but still carried the scar and the limp. He spoke softly, recalling how Calvin's eyes had looked that day, like he didn't know me, like nobody was there. The defense presented its argument with care. Calvin's attorney described a man unraveled by poverty and shame, someone consumed by silence, drink and despair, until the boundaries between thought and impulse disappeared. He reminded the court that his client had cooperated fully, that he had shown no resistance during arrest, that he had, in his own way, already surrendered. For the most part, Calvin remained motionless. He stared at the floor, breathing slow and steady. He spoke only to confirm his name, his age, and that he understood the charges. Then came the question every courtroom waits for, the one that sometimes changes everything. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Ruth," he said evenly, before sentencing, "do you wish to address the court?" For a long moment, Calvin said nothing. The room held its breath. Then he rose. At first, his voice was low, a rasping whisper that grew with every word. He began to curse under his breath, the words tumbling out faster, louder, until the quiet order of the courtroom shattered. "You think you're better than me," he shouted, glaring across the benches. "All of you, sitting there like you never judged me before. You laughed when I was down. You all did, every one of you." The bailiffs moved closer, but he kept going. "You call me mad, but you made me this way. You turned your backs when I needed help, when I asked for work. You let her talk about me like I was nothing." The clerk's pen froze mid-stroke. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Someone started to cry. The judge struck his gavel sharply, ordering restraint, but Calvin was already shaking, his voice breaking into hoarse fragments, curses, accusations, grief, and fury, all tangled into one violent release. It took 3 officers to pull him back into his seat. Even then, he kept shouting, spitting out words that no longer formed sentences, just raw sound, like something torn loose from reason itself. He was restrained for the remainder of the hearing. When silence finally returned, it felt heavy and unnatural, as if the air itself had gone still again, just like that morning in Harmony Hall. Justice Bernard Hensley waited a moment before continuing. His tone, when he spoke, was quiet and controlled. "This court has seen remorse before," he said. "But what we have witnessed today is not remorse. It is the echo of a conscience already undone." He read the sentences without looking up. Life imprisonment for each of the 2 murders. 20 years for attempted murder. 10 years for firearm possession, all to run concurrently. Calvin did not speak again. When the officers led him away, he kept his head bowed, his wrists trembling against the cuffs. Outside, rain was falling hard against the courthouse steps, a sudden tropical downpour that washed dust into the gutters and carried it out to sea. Some said that as he passed the doorway, he smiled. Others swore they heard him humming beneath his breath, the same strange, tuneless hum he'd carried since that morning by the river. Harmony Hall never fully returned to the quiet it once knew. In the months after the killings, people spoke softly when they passed the greenhouse on the bend, the one where Leanna Ruth had lived and died. The shutters stayed closed. The yard grew wild. Children walking home from school crossed to the other side of the road without needing to be told why. The house became part of the landscape, a memory disguised as a ruin. By the second rainy season, vines had begun to climb the porch railings. The paint peeled in long, pale strips. Inside, the sewing machine still sat near the window, its wheel frozen with rust. The kettle, now dull with age, remained on the stove where it had boiled dry that morning. At the bus stop, a faded wooden bench bore a small carving MP, the initials of Malcolm Peters, the man who had survived. He recovered slowly, walking with a limp that never left him. He moved away a year later, telling friends he couldn't stand the sound of passing engines anymore. They all reminded him of that gunshot. Down the road, the shop that had belonged to Judith Perryman reopened under new ownership. The shelves were restocked, the walls repainted, the sign replaced, but locals still called it Judith's Place, as if renaming it might disturb something that should be left at rest. From time to time, strangers would stop to ask where the incident had happened. Residents pointed vaguely up the hill and changed the subject. The people of Harmony Hall had learned that silence was safer than memory. Every December, as the air turns dry again and the wind carries the scent of ash from nearby cane fields, the story resurfaces, never in full, just fragments. A husband and wife, a neighbor at a bus stop, a woman sweeping her yard, a valley that went quiet for hours. Those who lived through it say the silence after the last shot was the loudest sound they ever heard. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind comes down from the hills, people swear they hear it again, that faint, tuneless humming, drifting from the old river bridge, the one where the police found Calvin Ruth sitting alone. They say it isn't a song anymore, just the memory of one. The story you've just heard is inspired by true events that took place here in the Caribbean. All names, places, and details have been changed to protect those involved. The people may be different, but the shadows, the silence, and the truth, those remain. Like, follow, and subscribe to Caribbean Crimes, where every island holds its own truth, and every tide brings another story to the shore.